Tuesday, October 31st is the last day to secure a 50% discount on Colson Center National Conference 2024 registration. To lock in the lowest ticket price before rates increase, register today at colsonconference.org/upstream. Join us this year for an expanded conference experience with more opportunities to learn how to live out a courageous faith in your life. Main sessions will include speakers like Calvin Robinson, Neil Shenvi, Kathy Cook, Sean McDowell, and more, followed by interactive breakouts to help you apply speaker insights to specific areas of your life. Don't miss out on this 50% savings. Register by Tuesday, October 31st at colsonconference.org/upstream. That's colsonconference.org/upstream. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. As we record this, it has now been over 2 weeks since Hamas terrorists breached Israel's border on October 7th, the Jewish Sabbath, and began slaughtering and torturing civilians. Over 1,400 souls lost their lives in this attack, the worst single day for Jews since the Holocaust. Israel has now responded with force in Gaza, intent on destroying Hamas and preventing this from happening again. A conflict like this can be gut-wrenching to watch in the best of times, but judging by reactions from academics, activists, media figures, and tense demonstrations around the world, these are not the best of times. The powder keg that has long been present along Israel's borders with its Palestinian neighbors risks setting off the rest of the Muslim world and ruining what looked like improving relations between Israel and its neighbors. What is it about this region uniquely that has the power to ignite such violence? Where does this hatred come from? What are its religious underpinnings? And how can peace ever be found? Most importantly for this podcast, how can Christians around the world think about and pray accurately for the people who call this small but embattled land, long described as holy, home? Joining me today to explore these and other questions is someone who has served on the ground there for decades and has dedicated his life to Christ and Christ's way of loving his neighbors. David Pileggi is an Anglican rector in Israel. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife Carol and directs Christ Church in the Old City of Jerusalem. They've lived in Israel for 43 years, where David worked as a journalist and researcher, and for 19 years was director of a study program dedicated to teaching Christians about the Jewish context of their faith. David has an MA from the Hebrew University in Jewish Studies and is a licensed tour guide. He's also been active in helping Palestinian children get medical care in Israeli hospitals and promotes education to prevent genocide and stop human trafficking. David Pileggi, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you, and it really is an honor to be with you this evening, my time at least.
It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon for me, so I thank you for graciously joining me here for a conversation. You know, I heard about you through a coworker who often listens to the Anglican Unscripted podcast, where you've been a guest several times. Tell us the story of how you first decided to dedicate your life to a flock in Jerusalem. Because when I first heard this, I thought, I've got to talk to this guy. What an experience.
43 years ago, 44 years ago, probably, I was living in Tampa, Florida, minding my own business, when metaphorically, at least, a ton of bricks hit me on the head. And every one of those bricks said, "Go to Israel." And from that moment onwards, it's as if I was pushed, propelled. People ask, "How did you get to Israel?" I say, I don't want to be flippant or funny, but it was a divine propulsion. It says that in Mark's gospel, when Jesus went into the desert, Mark uses very strong language. It says Jesus was pushed into the desert. Well, like my wife and I, Carol, we were only married 6 months. We were pushed to go to Israel. We arrived here in 1980. We had no idea why we were here, how long we were going to stay, what we were going to do, and we certainly didn't have any money, or very little money, when we arrived. And I know it sounds irresponsible and even a bit dicey, but, it's one of those strange things in which, the Lord was with us. The Lord went before us and opened a way. And one thing led to another, but it took 10 years for my wife and I to really come to an understanding why we were here and what we were supposed to do. And people say, well, why didn't you go home, in that 10-year period? Virtually, we were at times on the verge of a starvation, very confused, but I always would say to myself and to others, the calling was so strong. There were so many miracles involved with it, things that were out of the ordinary, couldn't be naturally or humanly explained, that I better have an equally strong calling, or I have to get a divine permission slip to go home. And after being here for a few years, we joined an Anglican congregation and eventually got involved. We went to the English-speaking congregation, the Hebrew-speaking congregation here at Christ Church. And in 1990, before the Gulf War, I was asked if I wanted to direct the ministry, the study tour ministry here at Christ Church called Shoresh. And it's when I took up that position that I knew that teaching Christians about Jewish roots was really my passion. And it was one of the reasons that I believe the Lord called us to Israel. But I might want to caution other people, don't try this at home, Shane. Okay? I mean, this is not perhaps standard operating procedure. And after working with Anglican groups for just about 20 years throughout Israel, including many of the leaders in the global south, I felt the call to be ordained. And after ordination, I was expecting or planning on serving the Lord as an ordained clergyman someplace other than Israel. And unexpectedly, a vacancy came up here at Christ Church. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. And I didn't apply for the job. And then someone on the search committee said, why haven't you applied? And I said, I don't have any real practical experience. I'd just been ordained several years before this vacancy or the position came available. And they said, we'll decide that for you. And ultimately, they decided they'd rather have me fill the position. Despite my lack of experience, they knew that I wasn't going anywhere. And one of the problems that we have, Shane, here in ministry and with other organizations that are obviously doing good things is that this part of the world is a bit like a train station, Grand Central Station. You have people coming and going. In many places, you don't really have stability. People come for 2 or 3 years or 4 years, and then they leave. Our family just could never afford to leave, because we never felt released to go. And so it's been 43 years, and we've raised 3 children here. And we've had a very, very exciting and an extremely interesting event-filled life. So I'm grateful to the way the Lord has cared for us and provided for us over those 43 years.
When you first arrived all those years ago in Jerusalem, what was your initial impression, or had you visited before that point?
When we arrived in 1980, I had visited Israel, about 2 years previously, and I'd stayed for 4 months. And I found the society then, and I still find it now, to be quite dynamic. And I enjoyed that sort of dynamism. But there was another element at work. 6 months into our stay, I started to think to myself, now, why does this feel so comfortable? And I was thinking of not only Jewish-Israeli culture, but the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, that we encountered. All of this feels like home. And it occurred to me a bit later that the culture here is very similar to the way that I grew up. My parents were Italian Americans. They were the first generation born in the United States, and they exhibited a lot of the cultural traits that I found here. So, for example, very intensely family orientated, yes, and everybody in the family puts their nose into your business. Lots of shouting, even when nobody's angry, for example. Or even before the days of mobile phones, my family, we would call each other 8 or 10 times a day and talk about nothing. All right. So these things and a lot more, you might say, actually prepared me to be able not only to tolerate a society or several cultures that are very different, but actually on most days, I enjoy it. Okay. I enjoy living here and I enjoy the people and I enjoy the challenges. And it was, you might say it was good preparation for a lifetime in Jerusalem.
It sounds like you're Mediterranean at heart, culturally and familially.
I am culturally an Italian at heart. Exactly.
You mentioned that your interest was sparked by educating Christians on the Jewish roots of their faith. Unpack that a little bit for me, because it's been many years since I visited Israel, and I'm not sure that I would agree with all of the theology that I was told by the pastor and guide who were taking us at the time. It was a bit more on the dispensational side. What is your take? And then when did you begin to realize, oh, visitors here really need this area of knowledge to bolster their understanding of their own faith?
I was given a book about 1990 or just during the Gulf War. And the book was Our Father Abraham by Marvin Wilson. It's a very well-known book published by Erdman's. I believe it's one of their biggest selling titles. And in this book, Professor Wilson, he gives a history of Jewish-Christian relations, which I thought, okay, that's very nice. I know that. But the second half of the book is actually quite practical. And he talks about what is it that we can learn from the Jewish people? What is it that they do well? And how might that benefit or bless or even strengthen Christian communities? And that's initially what got me quite excited. And then going to university and studying at the Hebrew University and learning more about Second Temple Judaism and the context, the Jewish context of the gospel, not the Jewish background, but the Jewish context of the gospel. So, for example, we talk about discipleship all the time, discipleship. But very rarely when we talk about discipleship do we mention, well, this was a Jewish spiritual practice. We might start with the navigators, and God bless the navigators for the work that they've done in stimulating our interest in discipleship. But what was Jesus doing in his Jewish context? What was similar and what did he do differently? Or the kingdom of heaven, for example. The kingdom of heaven is just another example. It is not totally a Jesus concept. It's an understanding of God's ruling and reigning that was deeply embedded in Jewish thinking and in Jewish theology in the day of Jesus. How did Jews understand that? How do they understand it to this day? How does Jesus take that and turn it, for example, to his own purposes? The importance of Hebrew, especially for New Testament studies. I mean, we have the very silly question in the United States or in other English-speaking countries. Folks will ask, what language did Jesus speak? Well, that's sort of an American question, right? Because most of us speak one language. But when you're in a small country and you're surrounded by many different cultures and even other countries that might be bigger and more powerful, then most people in the world will speak more than one language. And Jesus surely spoke Aramaic, but at times he spoke Hebrew, and we can prove that. And he did some of his teaching in Hebrew. So Hebrew becomes, right, Hebrew is important, almost as important as Greek, right, when studying the New Testament, right, understanding the culture, Jewish culture of the time, and so on. And all of this is important, not so that we can become Jewish wannabes or somehow worship at the statue of, or worship at the feet of the foundations of the state of Israel. I think it's essential for us so that we can be more intentional about our discipleship and have a better understanding of what it means to be followers of Jesus. And it's possible to live in Brazil or Bolivia, not know much about one's Jewish roots, and have a dynamic, intimate, authentic relationship with Jesus. But at the same time, I think you might say Jewish roots, even all the archaeology that's coming out of Israel, Dead Sea Scrolls, and more. All of these can and should be really helpful to the body of Christ and giving us, again, a better, deeper understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so-called Jewish roots, archaeology, Dead Sea Scrolls, they're also, you might say, a witness, or God has used all these things, or he's using all these things to speak to a very cynical and skeptical generation. And I think for those who are not believers, but who have eyes to see and ears to hear, I think in many ways these really flesh out, confirm, shed light on the Gospels. And it's pretty difficult now to say, well, somebody made this up, or these things weren't true, or it's the figment of someone's imagination, right? And when you have all this, you might say they're God's gifts, and again, to a very skeptical and cynical, you might say, unbelieving generation. So these are just a few things and more as to why Jewish roots fascinated me. But again, Jewish roots, in order not to become Jewish or to use them in a very shallow way, but really as a way to help us to become more intimate with Jesus of Nazareth.
Well, it's the historical and cultural motherland in so many ways, and there should be a sense of coming home or recognizing something original for all Christians when we step into that. I mean, the New Testament is it's a very clear testimony of the fact that those of us who count ourselves Gentiles, or whose families come from among the nations, not from among the chosen nation historically, are grafted in. We're brought in. We are adopted sons and daughters of Abraham, not the natural branches, as Paul calls them. And so there is this motherland element there. But I'm curious, in light of the whole religious conflict or tension in the region, what is the self-understanding that you sense from your Jewish Israeli neighbors? And I use Jewish in the broadest possible sense, because I realize that there are ethnic Jews who don't profess the faith of Judaism. Do they conceive of themselves as a Jewish nation or as a secular nation?
Well, you're asking the $64 million question. How do they identify themselves? And that's not easy, because you might say this ambiguity is inherent from the beginning. So the grandfather of Israel was a man called Theodore Herzl. And Theodore Herzl wrote a famous book in 1895, published in 1896. And the name of the book in German is Der Judenstaat. Now, how do you translate Der Judenstaat, or what does it mean in German, much less in English? Is it the Jewish state, or is it the state of the Jews? Should Israel be a Jewish state which reflects, perhaps in a religious, ethical way, Jewish values, Jewish concerns? Should Israel run according to Jewish law or Jewish tradition? Or is it a state of the Jews? And many of the Jews around the world, yes, are not observant, or they are Jews largely in an ethnic sense. I think it's important for your listeners to understand that to be a Jew has two components. I think the book of Exodus brings this out. On one hand, Jews are to be given a land. And when you have a piece of territory, one particular group has a piece of territory, you're an ethnic group. Yes, you have an ethnic identity. And at the same time, in the book of Exodus, God gives Israel a Torah, right? It gives Israel a book or commandments that later become a book, gives Israel these commandments, right? And this is a religious identity. And so there are two components, right, in Jewishness, right? A religious identity, an ethnic or national identity. And there wasn't I wouldn't say much of a split between the two until the Enlightenment, when many Jews decided to give up religion, but for many different reasons wanted to keep and hold on to that ethnic identity. And this is what today you would call secular Judaism or secular Jews. So there is something of a division in Israel. There's always been there. But just before the war broke out, many of these differences about the future of the state or what the state should look like were very, very, there was a lot of drama and a lot of, you might say, intensity between these two different ways of looking at things.
It sounds like something very dramatic in the operative self-conception of Israelis has changed in the last couple of weeks.
I don't know what the fallout is going to be from all of this, but it's going to be quite dramatic. There will be an earthquake after this Gaza campaign is over, and there will be an incredible amount of political fallout. And I'm actually quite concerned that many people who at one time thought that there could be some kind of agreement with the Palestinians or even some hope of reconciliation may just say it's useless. We're never going to be reconciled to or with the Palestinians. So this is, there are going to be some very serious consequences in Israel. The right-wing government of Mr. Netanyahu will not survive very long after this event. Israelis will hold him largely responsible for this debacle, and perhaps some of the populist sentiment in Israel, which was quite strong before October the 7th, will evaporate and disappear, because those parties advocating sort of a populist approach and those who were quite extreme in their political positions are going to end up having quite a lot of egg on their face, and they're certainly going to lose credibility. On the other hand, there is a soul searching. How could this have happened? The state of Israel was created to protect Jews, to keep us safe. And as you pointed out at the beginning of the program, many, many people have compared this to something akin to the Holocaust or something out of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, Jews were burnt in their synagogues. Yes, in Poland, Nazi-occupied Poland or the Ukraine, many Jews were just herded into wooden synagogues, and the German soldiers would set them on fire. And virtually, you had Hamas doing the same thing to Jewish families, on Kibbutz Kfar Aza or Kibbutz Ba'ari. And it just kind of brings up all of this trauma, all of these, you might say, Jewish nightmares. But then the question is, how could this have happened in Israel when we created this state to prevent that very thing? So,
if someone is sort of jumping into this conversation without a working knowledge of the history that led to this point, how would you summarize the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and how the situation became what it is today? Because a month ago, many people would not have pointed to Gaza and Hamas and said, most people, but just about anyone, right? This was an intelligence failure, and said, that's the threat on the level that it is. That's a September 11th threat. That's a Holocaust level threat. How did we get here?
Yes, it was an intelligence failure, but it was also a political failure, right? It was a failure on the part of Mr. Netanyahu and his political security doctrine. The question you ask is so huge that if I start talking now, I might only end 3 months from now. So I'll only just try to back up a few years. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's indeed religious. It's, you might say, there's certainly a spiritual element involved in this. Probably at its heart, there is a religious underpinning that most secular people in the West don't understand, because many Westerners, especially Western elites, can't take religion seriously. And so they focus on land or refugees or human rights, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to deny that any of these are important, especially the Palestinians, but there's something a lot deeper that's going on. Israel and the Palestinians in the mid 1990s came to some kind of rapprochement, some kind of agreement, which Israel negotiated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this was ultimately going to lead to something like two states for two different people. The Palestinians would have a state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel would, of course, continue to be the Jewish state within the pre-1948 borders, and maybe there would be some adjustments, in Jerusalem and some allowance for Jewish settlements in Palestinian areas. And this two-state solution, again, which was, you might say, driven in part by Israeli security needs and the PLO, ran into a lot of opposition, both in Israel and amongst the Palestinians. And the Palestinian opposition, in some ways, there were some similarities with the Israeli or Jewish opposition to what was known as the Oslo Accords. And the Islamicists in Palestinian society said, we don't want two states for two people. We want Palestine to be free from the river to the sea. We want Palestine to be an Islamic state. The Jews have no theological right. They have no claim theologically to a piece of territory that was once Islamic and really technically can't revert to or can't become Jewish, because Jews, like Christians, are second-class citizens within the Islamic world, and they have no right to rule or to reign over Muslims, or have no right to take control of territory that was once Islamic. And so at the height of this rapprochement between Israel and the Palestinians, which was never a Garden of Eden, but still an Islamic organization began to, actually, Hamas was the organization. It didn't start in the 90s. It has its roots in Gaza probably in the 1980s. But this Islamic organization began a campaign of violence as a way of trying to scuttle Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation or any Israeli-Palestinian deal. And so while Yitzhak Rabin was negotiating with Yasser Arafat, or they were signing agreements or coming to understandings, Hamas began a campaign of suicide bombings throughout Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, again, as a way to wreck this accord. And so when people say, well, this is all about the occupation, that's just not true, and it's very, very simplistic. Hamas is not about ending the occupation. They're about ending the state of Israel. And they're very clear in their charter. They want to destroy the state of Israel. They want everyone who's Jewish to, if they don't kill them, they want everyone who's Jewish whose family came to the Holy Land after 1917 to leave, to be sent away. And they want to have a country ruled by Islamic law. And they also have some messianic theology in there, right? This is somehow going to lead to some Islamic eschatology and all these things. And so, simply this was the reality. And in 2005, then Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, wisely, I think, decided that Israel should pull totally out of Gaza. Much of Gaza at that time was ruled by the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, the same folks that rule and still do rule most of the population centers of the West Bank. Israel pulled out because it didn't see any need to continue to be in Gaza. And 2 years later, Hamas, this Islamic, which becomes Islamic terrorist organization, it comes to power in Gaza because people are fed up with the corruption of Palestinian Liberation Organization. And virtually since that time, for the last 17 years, They have ruled the country in an Islamic dictatorship, right, with very little freedoms, certainly no democracy, no tolerance for minorities, et cetera, et cetera. And they've continued to campaign against Israel. And Israel pretty naturally just blockaded Gaza because Hamas was the enemy. And so again, you hear this mantra, Gaza is an open air prison. Well, Gaza, yes, to some extent, there's some truth to that. Gaza is an open air prison because the jailers of that prison, the gangsters, that run that prison, are seeking to harm, the citizens of Israel. So this is the basics. But then there's an Israeli component to all of this. And the Israeli component I think, has two parts to it. One, the people of Israel are pretty confused about what to do with the West Bank and what to do with the whole Palestinian problem. You might say that people are somehow just stuck. I would say before the Intifada of the year 2000 to 2004, 2005, in which Israel experienced wave after wave of suicide bombings, you probably had the majority of the people who wanted to conclude some kind of peace arrangement or some kind of peace deal with the Palestinians. After that period, support for any kind of quote-unquote peace, reconciliation, further Israeli withdrawal from these territories, it actually plummeted. The argument that I hear from Israelis, because you asked me this question, they say, well, the world tells us to pull out, just leave Gaza. If you leave Gaza, everything's going to be fine. If you leave South Lebanon, everything's going to be fine. If Israel would just leave the Sinai, everything will be fine. And Israelis reply, well, that's a great idea, but every time we leave someplace, what happens? It's turned into a base against us. So Gaza is now Hamastan, with missiles, et cetera, et cetera. Lebanon, you have a Shiite militia armed and directed by Iran with 120 or 130,000 missiles. They probably have more missiles now than even the United States does. Right? Many of them are sophisticated, and they're all, they all exist for Israel, okay, or to attack Israel. So then the Israelis ask, you want us to leave the West Bank? You want us to leave towns and villages that are just a few miles from our population centers? And you don't know what to do. It's almost like they're stuck to you might say stuck to a tar baby, at least now. Now, that's one part of the Israeli equation. The other part of the Israeli equation, since Israelis don't know what to do and they're kind of stuck, and much of the population does not want a Palestinian state, so Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been prime minister on and off for 16 years, he came up with this policy. And the policy was, let's see if we can separate Gaza from the West Bank. And we'll sort of prop up or do something to help Hamas, as long as they don't cause us any problems. And we will, foolishly in my opinion, but that's what was the policy, weaken, right, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. I don't think this was so totally cynical, but it was the policy. And Netanyahu, for example, arranged for the government of Qatar to give huge amounts of money to the people of Gaza. Last few years, it's been $1 billion. But it just so happened that Hamas stole $500 million, half of that money, and used it to build tunnels and buy weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So the policy, the Netanyahu policy of trying to have some, unwritten understanding with Hamas, kind of helping out the people of Gaza in order to strengthen Hamas, especially against the Palestinians that run the West Bank. All of that, of course, has collapsed, and it's been a failure. And the shock I think, for people in the ruling circles here is that Hamas didn't play by the rules, that had been set out for it. And that's why there'll be some very, very severe political consequences for this. And you might say psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, this is a wound that will take generations for the Israelis to process and to get over. It's as if what happened on October the 7th, it's as if you ripped open the wound of the Holocaust, the wound of the Arab-Israel conflict, the wound of Jews being expelled from Arab countries, whatever that may be. It's as if you had this wound that was starting to heal, but now it's been sort of ripped open again. And so you do have quite a traumatized, I'm not taking anything away, taking the trauma away from the Palestinians, but if we're talking about Israelis, you have a very traumatized nation. And it's been re-traumatized by all of this.
I'm talking today with David Pileggi, Rector of Christ Church, Jerusalem. We're talking about the deep ideas and beliefs behind the conflict in Israel and Gaza. We'll be right back after this. Every day, popular lies circulate on social media under the guise of positive self-affirmations and sound advice. Appealing slogans like, "You only live once," or "Follow your heart," lead us away from truth and leave us and those around us exhausted and discouraged. At our next Lighthouse Voices event, apologist and author Alisa Childers will provide valuable insights for Christians who want to respond to these harmful slogans with biblical truth and love. This free event will take place on Tuesday, November 7th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time and will be offered both online via live stream and in person at Focus on the Family headquarters. Spaces are limited, so claim your free spot today at colsoncenter.org/lighthousevoices. We're back on Upstream talking with David Pileggi, Rector of Christ Church in Jerusalem. You mentioned the trauma of Palestinians, and that is the sort of angle or the sort of interest that a lot of observers around the world have had, particularly younger and more liberal observers. And so I remember, for years ago, back in the early 2000s, you see a conflict, and it didn't look the same way internationally as it looks now. At least not to my memory, the widespread demonstrations, the academics in the West falling all over themselves to sort of almost applaud the violence that took place, or at least applaud the cause of Gaza. A lot of people having to walk back what they said because they spoke just horrifically too soon before the full extent of the violence against innocent Israelis was, civilians, was fully known. But you get this language thrown around, and one of the words that gets thrown around is apartheid, which of course brings up associations with South Africa and the colonial government there and Nelson Mandela and everything that went down there. Is that an appropriate comparison, or does it just obscure what's really going on in your thinking?
First of all, if I don't live in the United States or a Western country, but I would be quite fearful of this open support or sympathy for Hamas. It certainly shows that there are circles in our country, especially amongst younger people who will soon be in positions of leadership, who have lost their collective minds, who don't have any kind of an ethical compass anymore, or do not understand the basis of morality. What happened on October the 7th was a genocide. Genocide can never, ever be justified. And if people don't have enough maturity and enough historical nuance, or maybe even just common sense to say, I support the Palestinians, but at the same time, I'm going to condemn Hamas, or I cannot support what they did, then our society is in huge trouble. And I almost worry more about the United States than I would worry about Israel. It's, again, very frightening. It's almost it's something of like a Stalinist mindset, or it's as if we're reliving through the great cultural revolution of wokeness. So yes, that is the first thing. Secondly, there is racism in Israel. And I'll tell you honestly that racism is ugly, and Israel should be held to account just like every other democratic country. It should not be singled out and demonized for racism when, most countries around the world, have one form of racism or another. And that's where anti-Semitism comes in, right? Israel sells weapons to some questionable countries, but so too does France, and so too does the United States, and so too does Belgium, et cetera, et cetera. But to only pick out Israel, to only focus on Israel for doing something like this, again, it's a form of anti-Semitism. And I think people can and should hold Israel to a high standard. That standard should be the same that we apply to ourselves or apply to other countries. And by the way, just before we get to the apartheid part, why is it that hundreds of thousands of Syrian Muslims can be killed and there's hardly a street protest in Berlin, Paris? There aren't students at Harvard who are falling on the ground and tearing their clothes, and weeping and wailing. By the way, this may be uncomfortable for us to hear, but we invaded Iraq. Sorry, I'm sure it was all very well-meaning, but you have to ask yourself, how many innocent civilians died, right, in that unfortunate war? I'm sure some people will write me letters, but some estimates say, well, the so-called human collateral damage was 100,000 people. Where are the same folks, when all of this happened?
On the Anglican Unscripted podcast, you mentioned that there's a hardened or ossified way of looking at it that takes hold of people, where Hamas can do, or any of the other Palestinian governing bodies can do no wrong, and Israel can do no right. So in other words, there is no standard high enough that Israel can clear. They're just at fault always for everything. And that's obviously not a fair way of looking at it, but that's the ideology that people have swallowed.
Exactly. And someone cynically remarked today, or quipped, I heard, the press, especially the international press, will never forgive Israel for not bombing the Baptist hospital, right? You have a very unfortunate process that's here, in which Israel is demonized by in many places and in many institutions, et cetera, et cetera. It's as if Israel was born in iniquity and certainly can't do anything right. Or you have a group of people, which I also think can be very unhelpful, in which, Israel had some kind of virgin birth, in which, Israel is always right and it's innocent and it somehow never does anything wrong and it's always the other person's fault.
This was kind of the background that I was raised in, the second one there.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but Israel, like a lot of other countries, we have our share of racist, and we have some extremist groups that seem to become getting to be more and more popular. We have people who have become very hard, you might say, or hardened because of decades of violence, and they don't often care about the Palestinians. And at the same time, we have a lot of positive things going on. And to only pick out what's negative, or to focus on what's negative and not to also admire the positive, again, it's illogical. And again, it is very, very, very dangerous. There are many admirable things about Israeli society. Its freedom, its openness, right? Its democratic institutions, which are not perhaps as strong as the United States, a free press. We have 20% of the population are non-Jews who hold Israeli citizenship, including 3 members of my family. They have all the rights as Jewish citizens. We have increasing integration of Israeli Arab, most of them are Muslims, into Israeli society, becoming doctors, lawyers, accountants. That's not apartheid. But it is problematic is that the whole situation on the West Bank. And that's not easy to explain. And a lot of it isn't easy for me to either defend or to justify. And there needs to not only be a change of policy, Israeli policy on the West Bank, there also needs to be a change of its security and political doctrine. And I would say to people who are maybe critical or worried about Israel, Israel will not respond to people who it perceives to be as anti-Semites. Okay, but Israelis will listen to their friends or people that they perceive that are intrinsically not against them or don't hate them or are not anti-Semites or don't demonize. So all these people at Harvard or other places or the international press that somehow think that the people of Israel are going to take note of this kind of stuff. Largely, it's not going to happen. And probably ultimately any kind of economic boycott of Israel will fail. And further, for the people of Hamas, or again, of those who are anti-imperialist or anti-colonialism ideology, Israel's not Algeria. The French were driven out of Algeria through violence. The British were driven out of many of their colonies because there were either guerrilla movements or terrorism that drove the British out. It won't happen in Israel. There's no place for Israelis to go. Millions and millions of Israelis are not going anywhere. They're not going back to Germany, or they're not going back to France, or they're not going back to Morocco where they came from. That kind of violence or that conception or that way of trying to destroy Israel will never work. It will just never work, and it will lead to more and more and more and more violence. In the end, Jews and Arabs have to find some way to live together. And whether it ends up being a federated state or two states, I can't tell you, Shane. Although I will tell you one thing. There are folks who are sitting in the comfort of Cambridge, Massachusetts, or who are sitting somehow in the Midwest and think this is all, prophecy being fulfilled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is just, people need these kind of folks who really have no, you might say, stake in the Arab-Israel conflict. They need to stay out of it, or they need to do something or find ways to be positive and to bring people together, or to find practical channels that will somehow lead to reconciliation. It was Lauren Cunningham who just passed away. He was founder of YWAM. I think it's his quote. He used to say, God never gives grace for someone else's offense. And so we have a lot of folks here who take up the offense of the Palestinians. And usually they become more Palestinian than the Palestinians. And they hate Israel, and they're finding ways to never miss an opportunity to demonize Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And we have some people, fewer maybe, who do the same for Israel. I mean, every time the Arabs do something or the Palestinians do something, and they're more pro-Israel than Bibi Netanyahu. But it's not their fight. It's not the fight of most people around the world. And because it's not their fight, what happens is they don't understand the nuances. They don't understand the gray areas. They don't understand oftentimes where there could be compromise, or there could be a work towards reconciliation. Yeah, they're just on the side cheerleading. And Saul Bellow once said that the Holy Land is like a moral health resort. Lots of people come here and they feel really good about themselves because they've somehow protested the occupation, or they have, shouted for Palestinian rights, whatever it may be. And they go home and they can feel virtuous or somehow self-righteous, et cetera, et cetera. So here's my challenge to people who consider themselves to be really pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. If you tell me you're pro-Palestinian, okay, good. I mean, Palestinians need folks to love them. But I don't want to see or hear that you're pro-Palestinian, that being pro-Palestinian just means you're anti-Israel. If you're pro-Palestinian, I would hope that you know some Arabic, Palestinian Arabic. I would hope that you know something about Palestinian culture, and not just that Palestinians eat hummus, right? What's the number one favorite singer amongst Palestinians? What's the difference between Palestinians in Hebron and Palestinians in Nablus? What is the different dialects that people speak?
Or the Christian presence among Palestinians?
Or how about this? I'm just as concerned for the Palestinians in Lebanon and Syria as I am for the Palestinians who live in Nablus or Ramallah or Gaza. That's being genuinely pro-Palestinian. That's being honest, right? It's trying to engage the culture and learn something about them. And being pro-Palestinian also means you don't romanticize the Palestinian people. You see them honestly for their good points and their bad points, for their weaknesses, for their strengths. And the same goes for Israel, right? Our relationship with the Jewish people, it's not based on certain romanticism or biblical fundamentalism, or the basis isn't prophecy. And by the way, and neither should the basis of our support for Israel be some kind of Islamophobia or dislike of Arabs, whatever that may be, right? That we know something about the Jewish people and Jewish history, that we look at Israel not with stars in our eyes, but we look at Israel, we can see the good parts of the society, and we can also see, where the society is weak and perhaps fails ethically or morally. To me, that's what it means to be pro-Israel, to be genuinely concerned, right, for the people of Israel, or be genuinely concerned for Palestinian people, and to be honest about it. Okay, to be honest about it, and to be realistic. And again, there's so much romanticism that kind of surrounds Israel, the Jewish people, and now it's the Palestinians and their struggle to be free, et cetera, et cetera. Much of this stuff, especially in the West, has no basis in reality.
David, based on your having shepherded a flock of believers there in Jerusalem for so many years, and your belief that everybody needs Jesus, Jews, Muslims, he's the way, the truth, and the life. What is your scriptural theological vision for the region? Because it seems like you've differentiated it from a certain brand of prophecy thinking, but as a Christian, what's your great hope for that part of the world?
Well, let me just say that before I'm branded as someone who's against prophecy, I want to confess that I do believe we have an eschatological faith. I simply do not believe that it's apocalyptic, meaning, yes, there is an end and Jesus will come back, but is the apocalypse, the disaster, the end of the world, is it around the corner? Well, it might be. And my response to that is that we should always, always be ready and live life in such a way that we're prepared to meet the Lord, at any moment of the day. So yes, we should be ready, and many of us will be standing before the Lord sooner rather than later. This should be a main focus for each one of us, right? To be prepared, for the spiritually and otherwise for the end of life. So prophecy. So I think the basis of our relationship with Israel and the Jewish people cannot and should not be based on prophecy. It may be perhaps true, I don't know. But what happens is that Jews especially don't become the people who God loves, right? But they become objects. And we think in terms, well, we just have to make sure we move them so they settle the West Bank or rebuild the temple. And we don't really care about the consequences, for example, of rebuilding the temple. Or we see some fringe Jewish groups who want to rebuild the temple, and we send them $10, or we're sort of cheering them on and getting excited, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many Jews, I'll tell you, I've spoken to so many over the years, or at least educated Jews, They say, oh, all this evangelical support for us isn't based on any kind of real love or respect. They support us so they think that they will fulfill some prophecies and that Jesus will come back. And the thing that really, really is so hurtful and disturbing and makes people angry is in this whole dispensationalist understanding that 2/3 of the Jewish people are going to die, right? 2/3 of the, so yes, get them back here in the Holy Land, and then, there'll be wars and 2/3 will die, but then Jesus will come back, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the basis, for example, in the New Testament of what should be really our love and respect, for the Jewish people. Paul says in Romans 11 that God loves the Jewish people for the sake of the patriarchs, and I think we could and should do no less. And what do I mean by love? I don't mean something that's kind of sloppy or romantic or gushy, right? But if you're going to speak in these terms or act in these terms, especially with Jewish communities, just has to be very concrete and very practical, okay? It means we respect Judaism, even though we may not always theologically agree with it. It means that we have a certain respect for the state of Israel, even though we may not always think it's doing the right thing. And we can speak out about those things. It means that we'll stand up against anti-Semitism. It means that we'll really address or deal with anti-Semitism in the midst of the church and make sure that we are not using anti-Semitic tropes in our teaching and preaching, because the church, because of our past, we have a lot of authority, I think, to say we made a mistake, and we're telling other Christians as well as the general society, anti-Semitism is extremely dangerous. And by the way, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism hurts us. I wouldn't say as much as the Jewish people, but it hurts us theologically, because we end up having a distorted view of God and a twisted view of even the scriptures themselves. And as for Jesus and being a believer and a follower of Jesus, look, we're living in an age that's after the Holocaust. We're living in an age when you have the rise of the state of Israel, and you might say of maybe Jewish power, or Jews are no longer a minority in which they have to go along with everyone else. But at the same time, I think we as Christians need to be, as Paul would say in Romans chapter 1, that we're not ashamed of the gospel, and that we believe it's the power of God for salvation. And it's our policy here at Christ Church to, on one hand, respect Israeli sensibilities and Israeli culture, and we don't push, and I don't beat anyone over the head with a Bible. Although we have about 100,000 Israeli visitors a year, they come to see our church and why things inside the church are written in Hebrew, and learn something about the activities that our church and other Christians were engaged in the 19th century that actually were quite helpful to Jewish communities here in distress. And we just let people ask. And unashamedly, we just share who we are, why we're here, what we do. So standing on a street corner or yelling or talking to people who may not be interested doesn't work here. It's certainly not respectful. It does always backfire and doesn't take into account certain trauma. But a lot of Israelis and Muslims, Arabs, Israelis, Jewish Israelis, they ask. And if they ask, we tell. And many people think they need to be convinced somehow. I got to convince them about Jesus, I got to convince them about the prophecies. And, I just say, look, this is who we are. This is how we understand things. And it's God that has to convince you. Yes, you have to come pre-cooked. I can't, deceive. They think, when Christians talk to Jews about Jesus and talk about the prophecies, et cetera, that we're tricking people or deceiving people, and only, ignorant people fall for this. So, we're trying to live our faith. We're not ashamed of our faith. We're not ashamed of Jesus being the Messiah of Israel. And at the same time, we're trying to be a blessing to Jews and Arabs here. And hopefully our actions speak louder than words when folks don't want to hear. So that's sort of our understanding. I'll even go a little bit and a deeper. People tell me, well, what's the answer to this Middle East problem? The answer is Jesus, right? Jesus is the answer. And I think one of the things that we've learned over the years, that saying you believe in Jesus or saying you admire Jesus doesn't get you very far. Yes, if there's going to be transformation in the lives of a community or transformation in a family or a society, we have to put the teachings of Jesus into practice. Yes, we have to imitate him. We have to follow him, you might say. So it's understanding those teachings, you might say, and living them out.
Or perhaps take up that especially Jewish practice of discipleship.
Exactly, of discipleship. That's what brings change, yes. As you know, there are a lot of people who believe in Jesus in the United States, and it doesn't mean a whole lot. The divorce rate doesn't seem to go down, and the number of abortions that we have, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe I'm being unfair, but we have at least in some Western countries, in the United States, yes, I think this idea is that all we need is somehow to believe in Jesus. No, we need to, of course, having faith is essential and it's a great starting point, but we need to imitate the life of Jesus as Jesus has imitated God. And if we find that abstract or kind of hard, right, to be attached to Jesus, because that's the essence of discipleship. It's attachment in a very close personal relationship. Some people find that's like really fuzzy. Okay. And as Paul said on several occasions, follow me as I follow Christ, right? So we need mentors, right, to help us to live this out. This is the crying need in the world today, is that people we call ourselves believers, right, is to come to a place of maturity and holiness and to live out the teachings of Jesus, or to live out discipleship. Because, in many places around the world, in the last 200 years, people don't really want to know, for example, whether religion is true or not. What they want to know is, what effects does this religion have on people? How is it going to change things? What positive, results are going to come out of joining your group or your church, or however non-believers, might see such a thing. And one of the things that was really important to the Apostle Paul in the first century, and it's important to us, is the way that the gospel, the liberating message of the gospel, brings healing to ethnic divisions, brings healing to racism or hatred, and enables different groups of people, diverse groups of people, yes, to not only live together, but live together in a certain unified way where there can be mutual love, mutual support, et cetera, et cetera. And that coming together, right, that healing of human strife and division, which, by the way, the minute Adam and Eve sin, the second sin is that the two of them get into a scrap, right? And then, of course, Adam blames Eve. The next chapter, Cain is killing Abel. And, it sort of goes downhill, from there. And this inability to live with each other and to cooperate or to love others is plagued us, since the garden. And what is the Apostle Paul, especially, right? For him, the proof of the gospel in his context, his multicultural context, the proof of the gospel is that Jews and Gentiles, and rich and poor, yes, and slave and free, etc., they can live together in the Messiah. And Paul, for example, in Ephesians 2, he doesn't take away the diversity. He doesn't turn everyone into a McDonald's milkshake, right? Jewish believers keep that ethnic identity. Gentiles keep that ethnic identity, but they become one new man, right? With the emphasis on forgiving each other. And that one new man eventually, and here this is, I think, a lesson for our day and age, the end goal isn't diversity, right? I mean, everyone celebrates diversity, and that's not the goal, at least for Christians. The goal is found at the end of that chapter, that in our diversity, right, there is unity, and that becomes, or we become, a temple that's being built up where the presence of the Lord dwells, right? It's having the presence of God in our community. And yesterday's revised common lectionary reading, there's Moses in Exodus 33, and he tells the Lord, you better go with us to the promised land, because if you don't go with us and you just send an angel, he said, what will distinguish us from all the other nations of the world? What makes us different than all the other nations of the world? And that's a question the church should ask. We don't have the presence of the Lord. Yes, if God isn't dwelling richly, not just in my personal life or your personal life, but in the lives of our communities, that's the thing that will be noticed. And that's how we will be distinct and be different. And in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East, and now all over the world, you have this kind of tribalism, and you have folks who can't get along as never before with, division upon division, whether it's political or cultural or generational. And we're trying at Christ Church to kind of live out a different model. And I hope churches and other believing communities will also want to try to, you might say, to live that out as well. That's probably our one of our biggest challenges here. And we're working on it diligently.
Well said. My guest today has been David Pileggi, Rector of Christ Church in Jerusalem. David, thanks so much for joining me today on Upstream and for bringing light to this subject and giving Christians a vision to pray and work for.
Well, thank you again, Shane. It's a great honor to be on this podcast, and may the Lord bless you and bless all of your listeners.
God bless you too, brother. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media or by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.